Hey everybody, good morning from California. Welcome and thank you for coming to today's webinar. I hope everyone had a nice summer and you're having a great week. Today, Howard Greenberg from TLCC is presenting Take a Trip into the Forest, a Java primer on maps, trees, and collections. This webinar is brought to you as part of the free monthly webinar series from Team Studio and TLCC. My name is Courtney. I'm here representing Team Studio. I enjoyed getting to meet some of you last month at MWLUG in Austin, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week in London at Icon UK. I'm giving a session on the second day of Icon called the Marshmallow Challenge. It's going to be interactive and a lot of fun, so I hope you'll be able to come if you are attending the event. Paul Della Nebbia from TLCC is joining me on this webinar today, and we're your hosts. The two of us are going to give a quick intro, then we'll give Howard the floor. As most of you know, Team Studio provides tools for notes application development and management. This year, we're celebrating our 20th year in business. Some of our most well-known tools are Configurator, Chow, and Analyzer. We're continuing to update these products. We released edition 32.0 over the summer, and we're currently working on a new project that I'm excited to share with you around the end of October. For more information on any of our tools, visit teamstudio.com. Now I'd like to introduce IBM champion Paul Della Nebbia from TLCC. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Courtney. And welcome back, folks, to our webinar series. I hope you all had a great summer and you're having a good day as well. A couple of announcements first. We do have a sale on, and our most popular courses and course packages are available for XPages development, Notes and Domino development, and Domino administration as well. So that's started now, and it goes to September 30th. So take a look at that. There are some very good and sizable savings to be had. Howard, next slide. Now, although we're known as the training company, what really we've been doing mostly is development work over the past couple of years. So you can engage both Howard and myself, and we can help you to convert your notes applications, deliver responsive applications using Bootstrap or the mobile controls. We help our clients with delivering Java beans to enhance and speed up their applications. So this really is mostly what TLCC is doing now, and if you have a need, certainly engage us and we can help you out. Another thing is the skills transfer. So although we are developers, our background is in training, so we can help you and your team with the skills transfer and to learn XPages development as well. Next slide, Howard. So we have a couple of upcoming webinars that are scheduled. We're still looking for something in November, but watch the space. There'll be something there, I'm sure. But starting next month, Michael Smith is going to present on Bootstrap data tables. In December, we'll take a look at application modernization options. And that link on the slide, and the slides will be available to everyone who attended today's webinar, but that link provides access to all of our previous webinars as well. Next slide. Now, there will be a Q&A at the end, but I encourage you to post your questions in the questions panel as Howard is presenting, and then we'll field them at the end of his presentation. If you can't find your questions panel, and it does disappear on me occasionally, look for that ribbon and click on that little orange arrow to expand it, and then you can get to your questions pane. Howard?
Oh, thank you, Paul. Well, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everybody. My name is Howard Greenberg, and I'll be your presenter today. And I'm going to do a session I did at MWLUG. I know many of you couldn't make it there, especially our folks from Europe and from the Asia areas. So if you are, in the U.S., I do encourage you to check out MWUG next year. I know it's a long ways away, but they've actually already announced a location. It'll be in Washington, D.C. sometime in the first 2 weeks in August. So block your calendars, because it's a great event. So today I'm going to be talking about kind of some core Java things and how they relate to XPages, and in particular, members of the Java collections framework. And this is something I'm doing a lot of work with as part of our consulting. So as Paul mentioned, we've been a little bit about myself, I guess, before I get started. I've been an instructor for many years, since '95 in R3 days. And Paul and I started TLCC originally to do distance learning courses for Notes and Domino. Then XPages came onto the scene, and we started doing courses and development and training on XPages from the early days of the beta. Before that, I worked for IBM in the Personal Computer Group, and before that, I was actually an accountant, and just recently became certified as an information systems auditor. And also I'm involved in aviation. I'm a certified flight instructor. So as I started to say, we're going to talk today about some of the things I've kind of been working with in our consulting roles and also in terms of developing our Java courses, and how we can use members of the Java collections framework, which are things like maps and sets and lists, in our Java code that we use in XPages. So I'm going to kind of do an introduction to what those members of the collections framework are, and I want to kind of have lots of examples of how we're going to use those in some different XPages examples. And as Paul mentioned, we'll have time at the end for questions. So why use Java and XPages? Well, there's a number of reasons. First of all, performance. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, just to say that in my back in last year, I forget the exact month, but I have a link to that later on in the presentation. I did some performance timings and had an application that used server-side JavaScript and add functions and presented some information from several different databases that combined the information together and presented it in one repeat. And that took, I forget the exact time, but it was 2 or 3 seconds to refresh. Changing that to an all Java XPage design was storing the information in a Java objects, brought it down to a couple of milliseconds. So there's a tremendous difference in performance that you can realize by moving to Java. Probably one of the slowest things you could do is your @DB columns and @DB lookups. For some reason, those are fairly slow. And people put those in places that get performed multiple times, like in a repeat. And again, I'm not going to go into details on that, but I did cover that pretty extensively in that previous webinar, which is recorded and available for you. And if you haven't heard that or not familiar with some of those concepts like the XPages lifecycle, I encourage you to learn more about that, because it is very important to designing a good performing XPages application. I mentioned before that one of the benefits of Java are that you can easily grab data from different places, maybe different Domino databases, maybe something from a Domino database in your relational system, maybe reaching out over the web and getting some services. So one of the cool things of Java is that you can bring all that data in, store it in a Java object, attach that to, let's say, a repeat or a data table, and display the information to your user. So Java is great at doing that, and that's something we know I've been doing a lot of. Portability. What do we mean by portability? Well, there's 2 ways you can think of this. Portability could be on the front end, where instead of displaying your data in an XPage, you send the data out to some other web-based front end, like Angular or whatever, and surface it, send it out as a REST service, and surface it that way. So if you have your app, all your data, it has on the front end Java interfaces, well, it's pretty easy then to create maybe another Java interface to send out that data as a REST service. Okay, you've already done the hard work of building it into a Java object, collecting all the information from the various data sources. On the back end, you can also have Java be the tie between your Domino data and what you're displaying to the user, and in the middle have a Java controller. Jesse Gallagher and David Leedy have talked a lot about having a page controller for your applications. Well, it's pretty easy to then take it to the next step and not even put your data in Domino, maybe put it into a relational database, maybe put part of it into a relational database. So just kind of things to think of in terms of making the most out of your investment in your coding and kind of future-proofing it. Code maintenance, another benefit is you want to have, if all your code, all your logic is in your Java code, everything's in one place. If you're just writing an XPages application in server-side JavaScript, you're going to have server-side JavaScript all over the place. You know, you're going to be sticking logic into your rendered formulas and repeat formulas and everywhere else. And it's really hard to then find out, you know, what went wrong or to go make a change or update something. Having everything in Java, whereas your XPage is simply calling Java methods to display things or figuring out if something should be rendered or what have you, puts all that logic in one place, makes it a lot easier to debug and maintain. Probably the biggest reason for working with Java is that you've now expanded your universe from our small little universe of Domino/XPages developers to this huge universe of Java. There's a ton of tutorials and knowledge out there. If you Google, you know, how do I convert something that's in a tree set to a list, you'll find the answer in about 30 seconds, probably on Stack Overflow, or you might find a tutorial. There's just a tons of not just documentation, but knowledge and sample code and tutorials. Also, there's a ton of code out there of open source code, classes that you can bring into your application to do things. Maybe you want to go out to a web service. So there's classes out there to help pull in the data from a web service and parse out that data that you can use. So there's a ton of stuff already out there waiting for you to go out and get, and along with probably many examples of how to use those classes. Okay, so I'm kind of going to make an assumption here that the folks on the call know a little bit about Java and know what a managed bean is. So I'm not going to go through the code, but I will spend just a quick review of what a managed bean is. So a managed bean is a way to have your Java code be instantiated automatically when the XPage that's referencing that code is used by the user. And so the XPages runtime will handle the creation or the instantiation of your Java class. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the faces config file to tie what Java class we're using to a name that will be in the faces config file, and then we will also assign it a scope. So you're familiar with the request scope, view scope, session scope, or application scope. In our Java code, we're going to use getters and setters to allow access to the code in the Java class. And we're going to have a constructor. The only rule is it cannot have any arguments. So you can't pass any arguments into the constructor. So the managed bean is kind of a very easy way to just automatically have your Java code be available to your XPage. Now, you don't have to use managed beans. You can use what's called a plain old Java object, and you can instantiate that from within your XPages. But it is a nice, easy way to kind of have everything there and stay in memory for the life of your scope, whatever scope you assign it. So I do, now let me also point out on my slides, in this little green box, we have the sample code, in this case a Java file and an XPage. So, I will make available the demo databases to you and the slides as well. So you can go back and see a sample of a managed bean here and experiment with that if it's something you're not that familiar with. Okay, so let's talk about something that probably initially you say, why are you talking about scope variables and server-side JavaScript? This is a Java webinar. Well, let me bear with me for a second, and you'll see how these relate. So when we use scope variables, we'll refer to them by using the name of the scope, like session scope, and then we'll say dot test name being whatever name of the scope variable we want to give it. And at that point, we can read and write to that variable, and the XPages engine will maintain its scope, in this case, the session scope. And into that variable, we can store anything. It can be a string, a Boolean, a date, an array, Java object, anything except for Domino objects. You can't store Domino objects because they have to be able to be written to disk if the XPage is temporarily put on disk. So why am I mentioning this? Well, another way to access our scope variables is you can say session scope.get and give it a name and pull in whatever value was in that scope variable. Or we can say session scope.put and put a value into that particular variable. And what we're actually doing is a Java Hashmap. So you might not have known it if you haven't worked with Java Hashmaps before, but the scope variables are just Hashmaps, Java Hashmaps that the XPages engine is storing these scope variables in. So what's this Hashmap? What is this a part of? Well, it's a part of what's called the collections framework in Java. These are a group of Java classes that Sun provides as part of the language, and it's a root interface for a number of different classes and interfaces. So what's an interface? Well, an interface is kind of, think of that as a base set of methods and fields. Fields are also constants that classes can use. So we're going to typically work with a class for, when we go to use something, like a hash map would be a class, but the hash map implements an interface, in this case the map interface. And the map interface is part of the collections interface. So just something to kind of, you'll see the word interface in Java, and that's kind of what it is just kind of like a base definition. So talking more about the collections interface, the collections interface is a group of different interfaces. And let's say we're working with the Arraylist. The Arraylist is a class that we will use to store data in. That is based on the list interface, and then that is part of the collections interface. So this is kind of what the collections interface is these grouping of different other interfaces that are underneath it, and then underneath those interfaces are the different classes that are available for you to use. If we were to take another thing, let's say the tree set, to see the tree set would, let me have a little diagram. So the tree set would actually use the sorted set interface, which uses the set interface, which then uses the collections interface. So just to kind of an example of how this works, I mentioned the hash map, and you might not have seen that on the other chart because that's kind of a little separate in the collections interface because it uses a key and values pair, whereas the other ones don't. So the hash map in this case uses the map interface. If we were using a tree map, that would use the sorted map interface, which uses the map interface. So just some kind of just showing you the hierarchy of how these are implemented in Java. You can also see this in the documentation. When you look at the documentation, for example, in the Sun Java documentation for the Hashmap, you see that the Hashmap implements the map interface. It also implements some other interfaces, but the map interface is the one that's part of the collections interface. We can also see that under subclasses that the Hashmap has another class that uses the Hashmap class called the linked Hashmap. And so why all these different names? Because these all have different features, which we see here. So some of the implementations of the collections interface and some of the unique features of them are on this slide. So for example, we have the set implementation. The set implementation will provide basically the key thing about the set is that there's no duplicate elements. So think of an array that you might have used in server-side JavaScript or Java, and we can have duplicate elements of our data. But if we're using a set, it's going to make sure you don't have any duplicates. So then notice that we also have something called a sorted set, and then those are the implementations. And so if we were using the tree set, that would use the sorted set. And the tree set, just based on the name, whenever you see tree in something, in front of something, that means that it's going to automatically order the elements in that particular class. So whatever data we have will automatically get sorted if we use a tree set. Okay? Then we have the list implementation. An example of this is the array list. This is more like an array, that it does allow duplicates. This will also maintain the insertion order. So we're going to add things to the end, and it will maintain that order. And so then we have another one called the map interface. We mentioned that before. An example of this is the Hashmap. And this is different than the others in that we have a key value pair. So we can store something in, let's say, database title, and we can put in that the name of the database, you know, customers database or whatever you want to call it, and store that into as a key value pair into our map. And we can have a map of, let's say, all different configuration settings for our application. Now again, we have something called a tree map. A tree map, it has tree in front of it. That means it's going to automatically sort. It's going to automatically sort based on the key of the map. So so that's just kind of just some examples of some of the members of the collections implementation. Kind of confusing. So right now you're probably saying, well, how do I know which one to use? Well, there's this nice little flowchart I found on the web here, and let me get, let's see if I can get my little drawing tool here, figure out, okay, hopefully that's it. Okay, so I mentioned before a configuration type application where we might want to store configuration information about our application. So we probably would want to have a key value pair. So we'll, you know, if we start at the start icon, obviously, will contain key value pairs? Yes. So we probably want to go in this direction. Is order important? Well, I don't really care about the order. I just want to retrieve the data. So then we'd use a hash map. Okay. Conversely, let's say I wanted to store a bunch of information that I want to pass to a repeat. Well, I don't need the key value pairs, so I just need the values, right? So we can come to this direction. Will it contain duplicates? Yeah, we might have 2 John Smiths in our data. Maybe not, you know, then, but that's, then you might use something different. But in this case, we want to allow duplicates, so we would use an array list. If we did not want duplicates, then we might come down to here, and then we'd say, is order important, depending on if order was important or not. If we wanted it to be sorted, we might use a tree set. If we just want to maintain the original order, it would have the linked hash set. So just kind of this chart, it's in my slides, but you'll obviously find it on the web. So there's a million different variations of this. It's very helpful when you're first working with these to figure out what Java class should you use in your code. So I mentioned before an example of configuration data, and Paul and I do this on just about every application we work on. So some of you hopefully are not hard coding things in, like the location of your databases that store the data and the things like database title and things like that. That you might have already been doing this, and probably been doing this in your notes programming days going back 20 years, where you might have a form that held configuration information, and then you had a view where you could look up that information. And then when you move to XPages, you could, of course, carry that on with your server-side JavaScript. But the trouble is then you're doing a lookup every time you need to get that information. I already said lookups are slow, especially at DB lookup. So here's a great example of using a Java managed bean. We're going to make it have application scope, okay? So application scope means it's going to be shared by all the users, and the first time a user accesses an XPage that references this managed bean, it's going to load in all this configuration information into memory. Well, it's in memory. When users access this, or I should say your XPages access this information, it's going to be retrieved very, very fast. So we'll use a Hashmap for that. I already explained why on the previous chart, because we want to access the values by using a key. You know, tell me where my customer's database is. So a little bit on working with hash maps. So when we go create a hash map, we're going to create it by saying, first we'll declare it as a hash map. And then we have these things here that are called generics. That's where in the angle brackets, I say string comma string. So that's defining the data type of the key and the data type of the value we're going to store here. I'm not going to spend too much time on generics, but it is very, very good programming practices to use generics. You could not use them. You'll get a compiler warning, and you can suppress that warning in Domino Designer. But it is good to have generics and use generics because they'll keep you from making a mistake. This will not let you compile Java code storing something that's not a string in either the key or the value. Okay, so the name of my variable is going to be called config data, and I'm going to create a new empty hash map here. And I made it private. Why did I make it private, and what does that mean? That means that only code inside of my Java class can access config data. So how do we access it from an XPage? Well, skipping down here, we have a little get method here, get config method, where I pass it in the string of the key that I want to access. I test to see if that key is available in my config data, and then I return, if so, I return that. If not, I return just an empty string. And you could throw an error, you could, however you want to handle what happens if someone calls your method and the key's not there. How the data get in there? Well, in my constructor of my Java code, I'm going to use the put method. I'm going to walk through the view that has all my configuration settings and get the value from one column, put it into whatever I call that, key, which is probably in another column. So just to kind of summarize, here are the steps that I'm going to take. I'm going to have a notes view and a notes form that's going to hold configuration data. So one column will be the name of that configuration data. The other one will be the actual data. I'll create a Java class. I'll create in the faces config, I'll add the managed bean to the faces config and define a scope, in this case, application scope. I have to make sure my Java class implements a serializable method, otherwise you'll get an error the first time you run it. It'll be pretty obvious. So you just go back and add it. You create the private variable that I showed you. We'll have a constructor to walk the view to load up the data. At this point, when the XPage accesses this, it will run the constructor and load up all the data into our Hashmap. And on our XPage, we'll call this information using the getters that I have. So again, as I mentioned before, these are the demos here. So when you go back later on and try to look up what's going on, you can do that. So let's look in Domino Designer. And so I have in my database for the applications, I actually have two databases. One's for data, one's for my XPages. So in my view that holds the configuration information, I have some configuration information, a database title and something called data database, which is the path and name of my database that has the data. So that's my view I'm going to call. So in my faces config, I'll show you that real quick in case you aren't that familiar with managed beans. I have a setting in my config faces config file for this particular one. It says that the class is here, com.tlcc.configbean. The name of the managed bean is configbean. This is how I reference it on the XPage. And it's going to have an application scope, meaning it's usable by all the users and will stay in memory. Okay, so the actual Java class, as I said, it has to implement serializable. When you do that, you'll get prompted by the Domino Designer compiler to add a ID, and the option will be there just to create a default one you can use. Here's the code I showed you before where we're declaring our hash map. We're making it private. If something's private, that means I'm going to need a getter at least. I don't necessarily need a setter. That would only be if you want to set it from outside of the Java code, which I'm actually not doing. I do have a setter, but I'm actually not using in this case. So that's the code I walked through before. So that's what's going to happen on the XPage when we call getConfig, pass it in a key, it will return the data that's stored in the hash map. How does the data get there? Well, if I look at my constructor, I'm going to call this in my constructor, call this method called initbean. And initbean is going to load up my data. It's going to go to that view. It's going to walk through everything in the view. It's going to get what's in the first column as it's walking through. It's going to get what's in the second column for the values. It's going to use the put method to put it into my config data hash map. And that's it. On the XPage itself, I'm going to call this with some JavaScript in this case. So I'm going to say config bean, that was defined in the manage bean settings in the faces config. GetConfig is my method. This is the key that corresponds to the data. And then I had one for the database title as well. Same thing. So when I go to run this, it's going to pull up that information. One of the things I like doing with application scope beans is that since they do stay in memory for quite a while, the setting depends on settings in your application on your server. For somewhere I like to have an admin page where they can reset the configuration. Basically, that's just reloads the hash map, so it can get new values in case someone makes a change to your configuration settings, and you want those to take effect right away. So just kind of a little tip, makes it a lot easier. Otherwise, you could go in through the debug toolbar, and we could see here's our config bean, and we could remove it from memory, and the next time it's accessed, it'll reload. Okay, so that's kind of an example of configuration settings. Okay, so a little bit more on hash maps. So in the example I did before, we just used the get method. But But we might want to get in the hash map, we might want to get all the keys as a set so we can loop through them. So there's something called, this is our hash map. We can say .keyset. We'll get all the keys as a set. A set is a class in Java that you can iterate over using a for loop. You might want to iterate through all just the values, so there's a .values method in the Hashmap class. And then we have something called an entry set. An entry set gets both the value and the key as a set, meaning this will allow us to iterate through whatever's in the Hashmap. I have an example of code here. So let's say we have a Hashmap that has all the states, and the key is the abbreviated name, and the value in that state's hash map is the full name of the state. Okay, some of you folks who've done notes for a while might remember the aliases and how we can set those up in the combo boxes by creating a string that has a vertical bar in between them. Well, we can do the same on XPages with our combo boxes and list boxes. So we can take and build a string that has the value the user sees to the left of the vertical bar, and to the right of the vertical bar is the alias. So in this case, I'm going to loop through all the states. I'm going to get the value, which is the full state name, concatenate it to a vertical bar, add on the abbreviated name, and in this case, I'm just sending out a debug message. But then you could use that to build maybe a list that you send to a combo box. So just a little more on hash maps there. Continuing onward, a linked hash map is like a hash map, but a hash map doesn't maintain the insertion order. A hash map will be a random order of the data. So if we do need to keep the insertion order, we want to use a linked hash map. Well, why would we use that? Well, we already have nodes views that are sorted, and we want to keep that same sorting. Well, then we want to put our data into a linked hash map. So we can, if we do loop through them, getting all the values of the keys or the actual values, they're going to keep that same order that they were inserted in. So basically everything's the same, it's just that we'd use a different class and it will maintain the insertion order. The reason that the hash map exists is because it is, theoretically faster than a linked hash map because it doesn't have to maintain that order. But we're talking, nanoseconds. That's not something I'd worry about. Okay, another member of the collections interface is the Arraylist. These are very, very useful in XPages because we can send those to repeats. We can send them to combo boxes, list boxes, data tables, anywhere we want to send a list of data. Now the data doesn't, in the array list, doesn't have to be just a string. It could be a number, it can be a Boolean, it can be a custom class. So for repeat, that's real nice to be able to send an array list of a custom class. Maybe you have an employee class that has the name and the employer ID number, employee ID number, address, whatever. You might want to load those values into, for each person, load them into the employee class, pass that to the repeat, and then in the repeat, you use your repeat variable, and then you use whatever method is in that employee class to get the first name or get the last name or whatever you want. When we add information to an array list, we're going to use the add method, so not the put, we use the add. And this will just add information to the end of the array list, and it will maintain that insertion order. Okay, so here's an example of using the array list in using hash maps. In that, again, I said don't do DB columns. So if we have a view that has, let's say, going back to that example I had before with the states, we have a view that has the abbreviated name of the states, has the full name of the states. Yes, we can do an @DB column and get that information. Don't do that. It's slow. All your users are going to be doing getting the same information. Let's just load the values from the view and store it in memory as an application scope type bean maybe, and it's going to happen very fast. The other benefit is on our X page, we can just refer to that information with the expression language. Okay, the expression language is an alternative to server-side JavaScript that's much faster than server-side JavaScript. So in our beans, instead of saying this particular bean, we might have get states hashmap with parentheses. That's calling our method. But in the expression language, we drop the get part, and the states, notice the states is lowercase s instead of uppercase. So that's going to, under the covers, the XPages engine is going to be looking for a method called getStatesHashMap in the bean. So in this case, this will return a list that we can pass to a combo box. So we have an example of that. So let's look first. Let me pull up notes. Let me close some windows here. Okay, we'll keep that one open. Okay, so I have this view here in my data database that has the, as I mentioned before, the first column is the abbreviated name of the state, the abbreviation. The next column is the full name of the state. And in the same bean that I had before, I had a hash map for to hold the states. And so what I'm going to do then is in my constructor, let's go to the constructor, loading the states. So I'm calling load states, which is going to do the work of loading the states. And it's going to go to my data database and go to that all states view. And I'm going to walk through the view. And it's going to put into my states hash map the key and the value. So it's going to load that up. I'm also, just to show you the difference, I also have another hash map that's a linked hash map, that this one here, called states linked hash map. That's going to be a linked hash map, whereas the other one's a hash map, so we can compare the two and see what happens. Okay, so then when I have my getter, when I call getStatesHashMap, it's going to return, it's going to use the getStates method to pass it in the hash map, and the getStates is going to do the work of converting the hash map into a list. I want to return a list of all the states separated by the vertical bar with the alias to the right and the value to the left. So I'm going to use that code I showed you before, that entry set. So I'm going to say, okay, get the hash map that holds the abbreviated names and the full names, and get them as an entry set. And I'm going to use, as I loop through it, I'll be working with an entry object. And the entry object, I can use get value to get the value and get key to get the actual key as we loop through this. And I'm going to add this to an array list, right? So the array list I declared up here, and create an empty array list, and I add to the end of that this string that I created with the abbreviated name and the full name. When I'm all done, I return the that array list as a list. And when we look at it on my X page, right here, I have my combo box, and in the values for my combo box, I use the expression language and call states hash map. Okay, and that's going to call that method in my bean. Then for the one that's a linked hash map, I have another one called state sorted. That's another method in my bean that will return the list of all the states that were pulled from the linked hash map. So when we look at this in our browser, you see that the one that was just a hash map has absolutely no random, it's totally random, there's no sorting there. But the one that was stored in a linked hash map is sorted nicely from A to Z. So that's kind of the benefit of the linked hash map. This is sorted based on the key, and the key was our the abbreviation of the states. Okay, kind of switching gears here. excuse me for a second while I have a sip of water. Okay, so hopefully if you've been writing Java in Domino or server-side JavaScript, you've been recycling as you loop through views. You may or may not have known that if you're looping through a view using the column values, and some of those columns have notes date time in them, it's going to create a notes date time object that has to be recycled separately. So you might have been recycling the view entry, but you also have to go in and recycle these notes date time columns. So you kind of got to be real careful with that. Also, you probably noticed, when you're using Java, the Java API from IBM that comes with XPages, you have to use try-catch blocks, otherwise you get an error. So here I'm going to put a plugin for the Domino API on OpenNTF because it's a much simpler code patterns you have to work with. You don't have to worry about recycling. You don't have to use a try-catch block. And there's a lot of other cool things in there. They have support for logging and other neat features. And they just came out with version 3 about a month or two ago. A lot of good help from the creators and on Slack and Stack Overflow. So I do encourage you to try to use this in your application. Just some comparison of the codes. This is the old way using the API, Java API that comes with Domino and XPages. You have to recycle, you got to have a try-catch block, and you have to use a while loop. You have to get the first entry and hit next entry. On the other hand, if I had the Domino API, I don't have to have a try-catch block. You can if you want, it's probably still good programming, but you don't have to. I can just use a for loop. I don't have to use the get first and get next, and I don't have to worry about recycling. So the pattern much more readable. Okay, so going back to our Java collections, the another thing example we might have, we might want to get a list of values that's always sorted. So we said before, anything with the word tree in it is good. In this case, we also don't want duplicates. So a tree set would be real good. If we wanted duplicates, that would be another story, but a tree set will not allow duplicates. So like the example we had before, we might want to loop through a view and get a bunch of columns to use in a combo box, but we don't want those values to have any duplicates in them. So we could, of course, use like an array list and test to see, is this value already in my array list? If not, let's add it. But that's going to be slow. We can just add it to a tree set. If it's a duplicate, it just won't add a second one. It won't add the duplicate. So let's look at an example of that. And I'm going to actually have some different data. I have this in my data database. I should mention that when you get this data database, when you get the sample application, the data database will be empty. And in the admin screen, you have the ability to create the sample database with either 200 users or 10,000 users. So I have in my sample database 10,000 people. And we can see them in this view here where I have it categorized, in this case, by state. And if we look at some of the states like Alabama, you'll see there's a number of people who are in Birmingham, a number of people in Mobile, Huntsville. So a lot of duplicates of people who live in the same city. So what we want to do is for a particular state, we want to get the unique set of towns for the people who live in a particular state. So I have let me pull up that, don't need this anymore, don't need that. That's our X page. We'll come back to that in a second. And so I'm going to have a method on my X page to get all the towns in Arizona. And so let's go see how that's loaded. First of all, I have a tree set that's going to hold these towns, and it's going to be a string. And so I'm going to have a tree set called Arizona Towns. And in my constructor, I'm going to call getTowns is a method and pass it in the data database and pass it in Arizona because we want to get everyone from Arizona. And then we're going to go to the view I just showed you. We're going to get all the entries by key, the key being the name of the state, Arizona. We're going to go to my column here that had the town, get the name of the town, and then I'm going to add that to my tree set. So I am adding every town found for a state, and I'm letting the tree set worry about the duplicates. So when we go look at that, you see that my towns are sorted A to Z, and there's no duplicates. Okay, so that's kind of the benefit of the tree set, and I should have pointed out the constructor in my code, get Arizona Towns. It's pretty basic. It just returns the, actually I do want to point this out. This returns the all the towns in Arizona that you just saw. But if you are sharp, you're probably saying to yourself, well, Arizona Towns is a tree set, yet we're returning it, we're passing Arizona Towns as the argument to the constructor to build a new array list. Well, that's one of the benefits of the collections interface, is that we can often pass in, let's say in this case, a tree set to the constructor for a new array list, and it will convert this tree set that has our towns to be an array list. And then we return that as a list. So we want to always return the most generic interface that we can. So instead of, I could have said return an array list, that would work fine, but it's kind of good practice to return the most generic implementation or interface that you can. Okay, so suppose we wanted, you saw that the towns was sorted by the A to Z. That's what's called the natural order, natural sort order, which is what the tree set will do. However, sometimes you may not want the natural sort order, so you want to define your own sort order. So then we're going to use something called a comparator. A comparator will help us define a custom sort. So when I declare a tree set, I can declare it and pass in as the argument to my constructor for the tree set a comparator function. And this function, this comparator, we're going to say create a new comparator, and inside that we'll have a method. I should say we're creating a new class, and in that class has a method called the compare method. So what Java is going to do in the tree set, it's going to compare the first argument to the second argument. And it's going to use this as it's going through and comparing, A to B as it's going through a list of, let's say, A, B, C, D, and D. It's going to compare the two together. And as we compare it, it will say, okay, is what's this first argument equal or less than or greater than the second one? And we have to return an integer. If the integer is a negative number, then it's it should be sorted less than. If it's the same, then it will be a 0. If it's greater, then it'll be positive 0. So here we want a reverse sort order. So instead of saying O1.compare to O2, I'm going to say O2.compare to O1, which will do a reverse sort order. And in the compare to here, we'll just return a positive integer if it's greater than, return a 0 if it's the same, and a negative if it's less than. So in this method here, I'm going to add my Arizona towns. This method will be to get the Arizona towns reversed order. So I'm not actually going to store them in a separate tree set. I'm just going to create a temporary tree set called sorted that we're going to add our Arizona towns to. Arizona towns was already a tree set sorted A to Z, but I'm adding it to this new tree set that has a custom sort sorted Z to A, adding everything at once in the add all line, and then I return it as an array list to this method here. So on my X page, in this second one, I want to get the towns reversed. Oops, don't want that. So I go look at my values. I'm calling this other method Arizona towns reversed. That's going to use that custom comparator to reverse the sort order, which would be the second example here. So notice that it's sorted Z to A in this case, instead of the other way, which was the natural sort order. Okay, now suppose that we wanted to get all the towns in all the states in one object. So this is kind of, again, part of the fun of working with these is thinking through how do you want to store your data, or how can you store the data in terms of which collection class do you want to use, how do you, or which combination of collection classes do you use to store the data. So you kind of have to think and sit back and maybe get out a piece of paper and draw it out. You know, sometimes I'll spend an hour or two just thinking, how do I want to store the data? And maybe even building some quick little test cases to test out what I'm thinking of or what I drew out on paper to see if it's going to work. So let's say, and going back to my view, I had this view of everybody, all 10,000 people, categorized by state. So I want to get, maybe I want to get, for each state, I want to get a list of all the towns. So maybe I want to use a map, and in the map I'll have a key being the state name, and then I'm going to store as the value, instead of just a string, I want to store a list of all the towns. And in this case, I could use a tree set so that the states are sorted by the key, and then we can, you know, if we want to loop through it, we can get maybe get all the states in order. But then when we pull out the value might be a, in this case, also a tree set as well. So we might use a tree map to store the key value pair, where the key being the states and the value being a tree set of all the towns. So the towns will be unique and sorted. And the keys will be the natural order, A to Z. Okay, let me switch gears for a second and talk about something called the data object. The data object has nothing to do with core Java. It's something IBM added as part of the XPages, and you can see that in the little graphic screen grab I have here. The import is from com.ibm.xsp.model.dataObject. And we're going to implement the data object. When we do that, remember in implementation, we're implementing an interface. And when we implement an interface, we have to have certain methods that are defined by the interface. So the IBM, when they created the data object, said you have to have a get type, a set value, a get value, and is read only, which obviously would be Boolean. You have to have at least those 4 methods. You can add on other methods, but you have to have at least those 4 methods. So why do we want to use this? Well, this can be very convenient because the data object can store any data type. We don't have to store, like in my previous example with the configuration data, I was just storing strings. So my value for the database title and the database location and all those things had to be a string. but we might want to have one class that in the data object we want to store strings and booleans and maybe even an array list or whatever you want as the actual value that we're storing. So let's look at this. And let's look at, before we get into any code, let's look at a view here that is the data that I want to store. And so this is labels that I want to use in my application. In the first column is just the name of my label that we're giving it as developers. The second column is going to be the value. Now notice that the value here is either a string, but in many cases the value also can be multi-valued. So when we pull this out of the view in Domino, it's going to have that value be a vector of strings in this case. Actually, it's considered a vector of objects. So the code I had before with, that was just getting what was in the second column and passing it, converting it to a string and storing it in our hash map, that would throw an error, because as soon as it sees that it can't convert a vector of strings to a string, it's going to throw an error. So to handle this more complex data, we got to do something a little different. So again, this is where having the data object is helpful. Let me first, before I get into the actual working code, when I go to create a data object or a class that uses the data object, implementing the data object, so when we put that up into our class definition, we're going to get an error. When I click on the error, it says add unimplemented methods. Double click on that. It will add in all the methods that the interface says I have. It will also, so it will create the methods, but it will not put any code behind this. It will not create however we want to store this. That's all stuff we got to add. So I already have that created. And so I have, a hash map that stores, notice that my generic is object, meaning I can store any type of data in for the key, any type of data for the value. And then I fill in the get value and set value. The set value, notice I don't allow. So if someone calls the set value, if some other programmer picked up my code and tried to call the set value on my data object being class, it'll throw an error. And also, consequently, I want to say that it's read-only. So I'm going to loop through in my constructor and walk through the view and load up what was in the first column as the key and what was in the second column as the value. And I'm not going to worry about converting the data. I'm just going to grab whatever Domino gives me. So in my XPage, I can use those, and I'm just going to run the XPage because it just uses a get the. For now, let me just run it and show you what happens. So, oops, that's the wrong one. This is the right one. If I click on the right one, that would be good. It is the, which one is it? Okay, hold on. We'll start it from Domino, Domino Designer. I'm not sure I have that in the menu. Okay, so that's all we're doing is pulling in the labels and then the answers for our radio button and our checkbox. So in my XPage, I'm going to just use the expression language. Now here's something another benefit of the data object. I don't have to call the getter. Remember, the getter was get value. The XPages engine will take what's to the right of my manage bean name. This actually is the key, and it will translate that and use underneath the covers, use the get value method to say, okay, get the value of response 1. Consequently, same thing for our labels. I don't actually call. I mean, I could, if I was using server-side JavaScript, I could say data object bean dot get value, and then in the parameter say question 1. But the expression language knows use the get value method. It's going to assume that it's there because it's a data object implementation, and pass in question 1 to the get value. So just something that I find sometimes to be very handy to store this kind of information. Okay, let's go through a final example. And what I want to do is I want to take my 10,000 names, and I want to be able to let the users quickly drill down and find people in a certain state and town. So I'm going to first, let me just demo this first. Okay, so when this first loads, I'm going to assume that we're looking at Alabama. So I'm not going to get all 10,000 names because, you know, it's bad enough going through 5 screens of data just to see people in Alabama. But I'm going to make the user pick a state. And when we pick a state, we're going to load in all the people for that state. And notice now they're from all different towns, right? I can sort by last name, I can sort by the city, I can sort ascending or descending, but I could also filter by the town. And when I filter by the town, I still can sort, you know, by last name or ascending or descending. So this way we can kind of quickly sort the information the way the user wants to. And I'm making them choose the state to filter on, and then they can filter even more based on the city in that particular state. So how do I do this? Kind of easier if I show you a picture. So when the user selects a state, they're going to have to pick a state. We're going to load up into a Hashmap, customer's Hashmap, all the cities, and the key is going to be the city name. But the value is going to be an array list of all the people in that city. Now, when I have an array list of all the people in the city, I don't just want to show the name of the person. I want to have all the information about a person. So I'm going to create a custom class that we're going to have that's going to store the information about a person in this custom class. So we'll have, for each person in our array list, we'll have a person object that has everything about them, including the document ID of the actual notes document. So if the someone decides to edit this particular person, we can easily get the underlying notes document and let them do the edits and store that information back to that notes document. So we're going to have all these people objects in an array list, and the array list will be 1 per city. And we can access all the people by using the linked hash map of customers. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to hide all this complexity from the XPage, in that we're going to have a method in our bean that returns as an array list to the repeat just the way it's supposed to look like. So if the user decided to filter on a city, it's only going to return people in that city. If they decide to sort it, it will return an array list that's already sorted by last name, city. I don't think I actually sorted by email. Not sure why I had that there. I think I was sorting by last name and city. Oh, maybe I did do email. Okay. And then when the user switches to a different state, we're just going to reload all the people from that state into the customer's hash map. Okay, and then, so it's probably easier. I showed you the application. Let me show you the XPage. The XPage basically has no server-side JavaScript. The only server-side JavaScript I have is when we switch states, the onChange event will reload all the people again, and we'll do an update of my page. The other filters are just going to be tied to methods. In other words, when a person chooses a city filter, it's going to be tied to my report bean to the city filter. I will get it and set city filter. And same with my sorting, that I'm going to tie that to methods in my report bean. And then I'm going to have a repeat here that I have a var called state collection, and we're going to be repeating over person objects. So in my person object, I'll have a get first name, get last name, get city, get email. And so now we can go look at the code here. So when we call, first load this up, we're going to assume a particular state. You don't have to do that, but I assume that we're going to start off in Alabama. That's going to call load states. Load states is something different. That's just going to get the list of states. We kind of saw that before. What I'm going to call is, in my array, I'm going to call set people, and I'm going to get the filter, the state that they're filtering on. And just as a check, I want to make sure that they pick the state. If not, I'll, in this case, assume Arizona. That should never happen because I already, set Alabama as the default. I'm going to build an array list. This is going to be what I return back from the repeat. I'm going to get my data database. By the way, you can have a bean that calls another bean. So here I'm calling my config bean that we saw before to find out where my data database is. I'm going to go to this all contacts by state view. I'm going to get the category for that particular state. So I'll get all the people in, let's say, Arizona. And then I'm going to loop through the view and get all the information from the view for the people from all the different columns and create a new person. And so I'll create a new person object. I'll take that person object and I need to store it into my list of cities. So I'm going to first say, okay, does my customer's hash map contain that city? If it does, then I'll just go get that, and that'll be the customer list. Otherwise, I need to create a new array list to hold people for that city. Then I'll take the person, I'll just add them to the end of that list of customers for each city. And then I'll take the list of people for that city and put it into my customer's hash map for that state. Remember, we're only tracking one state at a time. I'll put them into the city that we're storing. So then when we switch and we want to get the people, this is a little different here in that, first of all, I want to see if I'm filtering based on the city. If I'm filtering based on a city, then I just go to my customer's hash map and I get all the people from that city. Remember, that's already an array list, and we'll put that in this variable called return list. If we are filtering based on a city, then I got to go, if I'm not filtering based on a city, in other words, my city filter is empty, then I want to loop through every town that's in my customer's hash map. So I loop through every town that's in the customer's hash map. My values will be an array list of people in each city, and I just want to get all the people from, actually it's an array list, so I want to get the array list of all the people in that city and add it to an array list that I'm going to use to return, of everybody that I want to return back to the repeat. So I'm going to get the array list, all the array list of all the people for that particular state. So that's if we're not filtering based on a city. Otherwise, I just get the people from that city. Now the next thing is the sorting. So here I'm going to use something a little different. I'm going to look to see what I'm sorting on, and then I'm going to sort. I'm going to use a method of the collections framework. So this is a static method called sort. I'm going to pass in the return list. This is what I want to sort. And then I'm going to have a static method in my bean to compare by the last name. So I have a comparator, which we saw before, by last name, that will remember that we're comparing people to people, right? We have an array list of people that we want to sort, and they don't really have a natural order to sort people, the person class. So we can't compare a person to another person. Okay, what we got to compare is the last name of that person to the last name of the other person, so we can sort the array list based on the last name of the person objects that are in the array list. So that's why I have these static sorts here to allow us to sort based on different ways we want to sort. And then we just look at, going back to where we were before, we just sort based on what the user wanted to sort on. Okay, so if they wanted to sort by last name, so we look at the sort column. If they want to sort by last name, then we say, okay, sort by last name. If they want to sort, if I said the sort order should be in reverse order, then we'll compare by last name descending. So we have all our different sorts depending on what filter the user chose. Okay, so that kind of is the filtering and sorting. So as you can see, we're storing all the information in the Java object, the Java class, the report bean class, and we handle all the sorting and filtering and everything right in that, working on something in memory. We're not calling a bunch of different Domino views to get the sorting. We're just doing everything in memory, and it happens very quick. Okay, so before I go through the list of resources, I had one quick little demo of an application we did for a customer. That what we did was they have an application that allows, it's an online university, and students can evaluate other people in the university. And so what they can do, what I did was take the application they had before, and I created a bootstrap slider so they can evaluate, so I can go through and evaluate other people, and I can save this. Now the trick, the issue before was when they wanted to view, when the instructor wanted to see how did people get evaluated, well, here's all that information in a notes view, and you can see it's not very easy to see what scores did all the students give to a particular student. So instead what we did was gather that information up in a Java class, and we created they can have multiple evaluations as they're going through the course. So if we wanted to see, okay, for the evaluation 2, what's the average of all the scores the student got? So instead of having this long big view, we just list the students and the average score they got. But if the instructor wants to see what did the other students give student 1, to kind of see, okay, you know, what students were giving, what other students evaluated this student, we can then see the detail. So all that's happening, again, in memory, very fast. We just pull the information into our Java class, store it the way that's going to allow it to be accessed very easily. Okay, so just some information here on where you can go for more information. I mentioned the webinar I had. We have some Java classes as well if you want to learn more about using Java and XPages. Again, Stack Overflow and Google, we're in the Java world. There's tons of information out there on the web. Paul mentioned the sale that we're having. You can get an additional 5% off on any sale item, or 20% off anything not on sale if you go to this link, and that's also where the download database is, the demo databases that I had. Okay, I think we're ready for questions. So you can ask questions in the questions pane. And just as Courtney mentioned, we got some upcoming events. And we're kind of getting, I want to allow time for questions. So Paul, let's go right to the questions.
Okay, to all attendees, please don't hold back. Post your questions. We have a couple for you, Howard, but just a couple right now. So both of these are from Ivana, and she would like to know, are there any limits in terms of how much information you can store in a hash map? So what if you have a view with thousands and thousands, and you showed us an example of the 10,000 documents in that view, but are there any limits to storing information in a hash map and in a managed bean?
Well, there's no hard limits. The limits are based on memory. So I had 10,000 people, and as I said, I only brought in people from one state. So that was, the biggest state was California, and I think there's 2,300 people in there. But you have to figure, in this particular case, I was storing, I think, 5 or 6 pieces of information. And each one is, I don't know, I didn't count it up, but let's say they're 25 bytes, 30 bytes, 50 bytes, times the 5 or 6 pieces of information, you know, maybe there's a couple hundred bytes per line, times 10,000. That's not a very big number of RAM that we're using. So yes, you might not want to store a ton of information. You can watch your memory usage by using the XPages toolbox. And again, the other key thing is the scope. Okay, I don't want to, if I did this as a session scope variable, then that lives for a while, and it lives. That's how long your session scope variables live, is set in your application settings or your server settings or the default. And so if I do it just as a view scope or request scope, a view scope is only going to live for the life of the X page. The minute the user goes to another X page, then it's taken out of memory. Or even better yet, a request scope will only exist while it's being requested. So you want to pick your scopes carefully, and you want to try to stay away from the session scope, because for each user that's going to store the data, use the session scope sparingly, because that does exist for a much longer period of time than the view scope. And again, don't store a million things. But if you're storing 10,000 things, 20,000 things, and it's only a couple hundred bytes each, that's not a lot of memory that we're talking about.
Okay. Another question from Ivana. So are there concurrency issues to consider? And she's provided an example. So if you have a hash map in a managed bean with application scope, and you're allowing your users to not only access the information, but also change the data that's being returned from the hash map, are there any concurrency issues to consider?
In that case, you might want to consider that and use thread safe programming. Make sure somehow you have a way to lock that. Typically, anything that's application scope, it's not something I want the users to change. At least not all the users. Typically the application scope I'm going to use more for application-wide configuration settings. But if you had a lot of users and they were all allowed to change the data, then then I think you might have to do a little more careful programming.
Okay. Question from Deb. And what's the event that you mentioned in Washington? I see you don't have it in your upcoming events there.
Well, it's not until next August, and it's MWLUG, and they do have a tradition of announcing the next city at the close of each event. So the MWLUG was in Austin in about 3 weeks ago, and they announced that it would be in Washington, D.C. in the first 2 weeks of August, but they don't have any details. They'll of course start working on planning that, and probably won't start having details until sometime spring of next year.
Okay. Question from Bob. Could your config bean have a private property with a getter that is a Domino object, like a database or a view?
No, you cannot store any Domino objects into a Java method property or variable, because you're implementing serializable. Serializable means that everything that's in memory could be written out to the disk if the XPages engine needs to do that, and that depends on a lot on your settings as well. So when it's written out to disk, it loses that link to the backend Domino object. So you're going to get an error. So everything, instead of storing, let's say, a Domino document, what you'd want to store would be the document ID for that document, and then you pull the document in as needed to reference information or read or write to it.
Okay, and a question from Don here. If you have your configuration information in a managed bean, like your database string or URL, do you still need to load it into a scope variable, or could you simply access it directly from the managed bean?
Yeah, good question. No, you basically forget about scope variables. Okay, the managed bean is replacing your scope variable, and then you just reference it, assuming that your managed bean, well, regardless of the scope that the managed bean had, ideally you want to make it application scope for this type of configuration information, because it's going to be shared by all the users, and you want it to stay in memory for quite a long time. So you're going to just pull it into the managed bean and access it in the managed bean through the getter or setter. Or if you're using the data object that I showed you, you could just say the name of the bean dot and then whatever key that you assigned it.
Okay, and another question from Deb. How does the document level security, editor access, read access, how is that maintained in Hashmaps? Can that be maintained in Hashmaps?
Well, it's not. I mean, these are Java objects. You're storing the information. Now, if the user is pulling the information, if in your constructor or however you load up the data, you're pulling the information in from Domino views, the user can only pull in the information from the view that they have access to. And that's assuming you're not using the session assigner or the equivalent of that, which lets the code run with the rights of the developer. But typically, the code runs with the rights of the user, and so the user is only pulling in the information that that they can access, and therefore you're going to only, in the code when it runs, it's only going to be storing the information that the user had access to.
Okay, and question from John. Will you be doing a webinar on using beans via RPC so the user can access the bean information from client-side events?
No, not really. I mean, that's basically, there is a remote procedure call capability as part of the extension library, and then you can from that, you can basically just reference the bean like you would, anything else. It's just in the properties of the remote procedure call. So don't really have any plans on that specifically.
And we've got one more question here. Not sure this one applies here. Can we use these with Open UI5, SAP UI5?
I'm not familiar with those.
I was a little worried about that one too.
Yeah, sorry.
So a question from Stephen, just added here. Why is the person class in the report bean class instead of its own class?
It just depends on what you want to do. I used it as an inner class, and you can do that, or you can set it up as its own class and have it as a separate class. It's just kind of for something simple and something that's not going to be used anywhere else, I just like using the inner classes, but you can use it as a separate class, especially if you're going to be using it in other ones, in other classes. Then it would make sense to duplicate that information. So good question.
Okay, and that's all our questions, and I'm looking at the clock. I think that's time as well.
Yeah, great. Oh, well, thank you everyone for attending, and please have a good rest of your day. And thank you, Paul, for being the host, and as well as Courtney.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Courtney, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you.